Letter 20, The Pontifical States, by Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley. Wherever the Catholic religion is established, I have uniformly observed indolence, with its concomitants, dirt and beggary, to prevail, and the more Catholic is the place, the more they abound. 35. These are the words of a clever writer, well acquainted with Rome. Apropos of Rome, it must be added that wherever the Catholic religion prevails, great works of charity subsist. During the time of Catholicism, charitable institutions, as is well known, abounded all over England. In some few obscure corners such still survive, where the old may find a peaceful refuge, not in crowded receptacles, where they are looked on as useless burthens on a heavily taxed parish, but in decent almshouses, bordering grassy enclosures, near gardens that supply their table, peaceful nooks, where the aged may converse with nature, and find the way to the grave soothed by that calm so dear to declining years. 36. Jesus Christ so forcibly recommended the poor to all who professed his religion, that, in common with all other Christians, every good Catholic considers works of charity to be his paramount duty. One of the most enlightened, Pascal, gave a touching proof of this, when, on his deathbed, he only admitted his pains to be soothed by careful nursing, on condition that two paupers in the same state should receive the same attentions in an adjoining apartment. The poor were to him objects of real and tender affection. As eleemosynary charity is an essential portion of Catholicism, we may expect that it should flourish in the capital of the Catholic world. There are many beggars, but there is no absolute want. At Rome, beggary is a condition, and it becomes a matter of favor to be allowed to beg. Plates of metal are given to such as are permitted, and fastened to the arm of poor deformed objects, who are to be found in every corner of the city, asking alms. Many convents distribute food regularly at different hours, when all who ask may have. There is, besides, a house of industry, I hear, carried on excellent principles. There are, to the destruction of the savings of the poor, state lotteries all over Italy. It was considered that this demoralizing gambling ought not to be kept up in the capital of the head of the church, but it was argued that a love of putting in the lottery could not be rooted out, and while Naples, Tuscany, and Venice had lotteries, the Romans would send their money to those states, if they could not be indulged at home. A Roman lottery therefore exists, and the proceeds go to keep up a house of industry. Here a number of young people are taught various trades. Young men are apprenticed, and girls receive dowries, while the old people have a home that smooths their passage to the grave. Besides these conventual aids and government institutions, there are many confraternities of citizens whose bond of duty is charity to the sick and poor. People of all classes of society belong to them, and meet on an equal footing. The city is divided into several quarters, and the various confraternities have each one assigned to them, which they visit and relieve. Several of the persons I know remained in Rome during the visitation of the cholera in 1837, and they still vividly remember the horror of the time. It was a conviction, a superstition nourished by the Church, that this fatal epidemic would spare the Holy City, and the arguments urged to prove its exemption were absurd, and yet horrible to hear. When the great heats of August set in, and a few cases began to be mentioned, the government, grown frantic through mingled terror and folly, thought only of convincing the people that Rome would be spared. The pest might be said to have been welcomed by illuminations and processions, and its virulence propagated and fixed by the poor people being encouraged to go about barefoot, while their last coin was drained from them to buy oil for lamps to burn in the churches. The stench and heat in these edifices became of itself pestilential, for the summer was more sultry even than usual, and the crowds that filled them were tremendous. Groups of persons were to be seen in the streets and churches, standing barefoot before the Madonnas and crucifixes, expecting to see the images open their eyes and shed blood, both of which miracles, it was averred, had taken place. But this absurd buffoonery sunk into insignificance, compared with the dreadful ideas purposely put into the people's minds about poison. In the early stage of the epidemic, several persons fell victims to the frenzy thus occasioned. In the middle of August, the most splendid illuminations had place all over Rome, a thanksgiving to God for sparing the city. On the 15th, the Pope set out in procession to accompany a famous Black Madonna from the church of Santa Maria Maggiore to St. Peter's. Thrice he was stopped by storms. People crowded in to join from all the towns and villages in a circuit of many miles. The vast concourse, the excitement of the procession, and the violent rains to which they were exposed, barefoot and bareheaded, tended only to exasperate the power of the epidemic. On that day many persons died. The illusion vanished. It was admitted that the cholera was in Rome. Strangers and nobles fled, and for 2 months the most fearful scenes had place. The dead cart went all night. People fell down in the streets, convulsed by the frightful spasms of that terrible disease. 15,000 persons, about 1 in 10 of the whole population, 150,000 died at Rome. The Pope shut himself up in the Quirinal. Everyone who entered the palace was obliged to undergo fumigation, a thing abhorrent to the Romans, who detest every kind of perfume. An imperative order was issued that the cardinals, the heads of government, and various employees should not quit the city, but it was very ill obeyed. Government was indeed paralyzed, and great fears were entertained, especially at first, of the violence of the ignorant and wretchedly misguided people. "If you were to imagine the devil insane," wrote an English gentleman, "it might give you some notion of the state of things, and they already talk of sending for some Austrian troops." As the epidemic pursued its course, the people grew at first familiar with it and then cowed. Their state was most horrible. I have heard, from one who was on the spot, that it was greatly to be doubted whether all who were borne nightly in the dead carts to hideous, unhonored sepulture really died of cholera. There was reason to believe that many were victims of a virulent typhus, brought on by acts of superstition and excessive fear, and worse still, that numbers died of starvation. The administrators of government having for the most part fled or shut themselves up, a strict cordon being drawn round the city, and the neighborhood struck with inconceivable panic. Food grew scarce, and the poor wretches who had spent their last in propitiating heaven by lamps and candles, without money and without succor, died of want. Yet there was not absent many redeeming touches in the dark picture of the times. The regular clergy fulfilled their duties unshrinkingly, and the conduct of the Jesuits was particularly admirable. They visited every corner of the city, watching by deathbeds with unwearied zeal. They were seen taking, with gentle care, babes from the sides of their mothers, who lay dead in the streets, wrapping them tenderly in their black gowns, and carrying them to places appointed for their refuge. The confraternities also did not desert their post. A Roman told me he was one of 3 brothers. They removed their aged father to a safe place, at a distance from contagion, and remained themselves. They were employed at different quarters of the city. "I never felt happier," said my informant. "Our father was in safety, we had no fears for ourselves. All day we were busied among the sick, and when we met in the evening, it was with light hearts. The employment gave us something to do and to think about. The dangers we might be supposed to run endeared us to each other. I remember now with regret the sort of exhilaration with which we met, thanked God for our preservation, and then again went to our task, not only without fear, but with a feeling of gladness superior to every other happiness." The few English, also, who remained, displayed unshrinking courage. Lord 100, in particular, a Catholic nobleman, acted with a heroism that shamed the cardinals and heads of the state. He earnestly strove to prove how erroneous was the fear of contagion. The succor he brought, and the example he displayed, were of the utmost utility, and saved many, many lives. The country round Rome, each town and village within its cordon, was left pretty much to itself. No disturbances occurred, and the people showed themselves much more capable than could have been supposed of self-government. One English family took refuge at Olvano, a small town, some 15 miles from Rome. They went thither without the intention of remaining. They took very little money with them, and could get nothing from Rome. The people of this little place showed them a kindness at once singular and touching. They not only provided them with provisions, but exerted themselves to please and amuse them. Each day some little fete was given by the mere country people for their diversion, so that they seemed, like the personages of the Decameron, to have escaped from a city of the pest, to enjoy the innocent pleasures of life with the greater zest. Such is the amiable and courteous disposition of this people, except when their violent passions urge them to crimes, which they scarcely look on as wicked, for they are taught, for heresy, read any sin against the ordinances of the Church. Where men's wants are few and easily supplied, where a benignant climate clothes the earth in abundance, and nature is the indulgent mother instead of the stern overseer of our species, men have leisure, and if they are idle, they become vicious. The air of Rome inspires lassitude, and renders the inhabitants inert. The Romans who live in the healthy parts of the city are all inclined to grow fat. their language, unidiomatic, and so to speak, long-winded in its expressions, is pronounced with a grace of accent, a slow and melodious emphasis that renders it more agreeable than any other Italian to the ears of strangers, and is strangely in harmony with the dreamy contentment of their minds. Accustomed to receive and to gain by foreigners, they are courteous, amiable, and ready to serve. There is among them an air of easy indolence, which, though it militates against our notions of manly energy, yet is never brutalized into stupidity. The women are among the most beautiful of the Italians. You feel as if all lived under a spell, and so they do, for troubled and unquiet as is the rest of the papal dominions, Rome and its immediate neighborhood remains in a sort of hazy apathy. The Pope appreciates highly their passive submission, and does all he can to keep them from communicating with the discontented districts. For this reason, he is opposed to the construction of railroads, that, as he says, his revolutionary subjects of the East may not corrupt his obedient children of the West. To the outward eye, the papal government pays a slight tribute to the increased demands of the times. There is more decency in the lives of the clergy, there is more done for the poor. But it is not eleemosynary charity that is needed, it is the spirit of improvement, just laws and an upright administration. None of these exist, and even scientific knowledge, encouraged in other parts of the peninsula, is forbidden. Meanwhile, penal laws are slight and seldom enforced. There is, some 15 miles from the city, a miserable collection of huts, in the middle of a tract of country, the peculiar haunt of malaria. It is called Campo Morto and is an asylum of the church. All criminals who fear being taken fly hither. The spot, consecrated as an asylum, is watched by soldiers. The fugitive who once enters the fatal bounds never dares leave them. 3 years is the extent to which a man can drag out existence in this pestilential atmosphere. So here the hardened criminal comes to die, in his desire to escape from death. He is soon struck by fever, grows feeble and emaciated, and at his appointed hour is gathered to the grave. The papal government is considered the worst in Italy, and the temporal rule of the Church is looked upon as the chief source of the nation's misfortunes. This is no novel assertion. You may remember Dante's apostrophe. In the Middle Ages, the temporal power of the popes urged them on to many acts of unjustifiable aggression. Yet, as the faith of nations in those days made them strong, the people were, for the most part, their friends. Kings, their enemies, and often they made the latter tremble on their thrones, while they showed themselves the protectors of the former. The popes were then Guelphs, and watched over civil liberty, till attachment to temporal riches turned them into Ghibellines, and led them to support the pretensions of sovereigns to absolute power. Savonarola denounced this unholy alliance as subversive of the purity, and even existence, of the Church. As faith decayed, and reform grew imminent, the compact between the head of a religion that preached equality and the sovereigns who aimed at despotism was sealed. While as the revenues of the Church, so lately swollen by tributes from all the Christian world, decreased, the pontiffs clung more tenaciously to the few miles of territory which they claimed as their own. Before the First French Revolution, English travelers denounced the temporal rule of the popes as corrupt and odious. It subsists now as it did then. Only things are worse, partly, because all that does not improve must deteriorate, partly, that the uses and end of government are better understood, and abuses become more torturing and intolerable, and partly, because the checks and restraints which time and custom oppose to their tyranny are now all swept away. The Pope and his prelates alone are invested with political, legislative, and administrative authority and constitute the state. From education and from system they are despotic and repel every liberal notion, every social progress. The people pay and obey. All the offices, all the employments, great and small, are in the hands of the clergy. From the Pope to the lowest priestly magistrate, all live on the public revenues, whence springs a system of clients, which existing principally in Rome, yet extends over the whole of the papal dominions, and creates a crowd of dependents devoted to the clergy. Corruption is the mainspring of the state, which rests on the cupidity which the absence of all incentive to, or compensation for, honest labor inspires. Yet nearly all are poor, and poorest is the head of the whole, who, shrinking from all improvement, fearful if the closed valves were opened, he should admit in one rushing stream, with industry and knowledge, rebellion, yet finds that the fresh burthens which his necessities cause him to impose on the people fail to increase his revenue. The Romans, themselves, submit without repining. Their state has existed, such as it is, for centuries. The abode of the Pope and concourse of strangers enrich, the church ceremonies amuse them. But out of Rome, the cry has been loud, and will be repeated again and again. The marches bordering the Adriatic, Romagna and the four legations, 4 cities, each governed by a cardinal legate, suffer evils comparatively new to them, and the memory of better days incites them to endeavor to recover their former independence. These states formed, it is true, a portion of the pontifical dominions before the French Revolution, but they existed then on a different footing, and enjoyed privileges of which they are now deprived. Bologna in especial considers herself aggrieved. During the reign of Pope Nicholas V, driven by the political necessities of the times, Bologna placed itself under the protection of the papal government. The city engaged to pay an annual tribute and to acknowledge the sovereignty of the pontiff, while he, on the other hand, guaranteed its independence and a representative senate to rule the state. Such was its position till the French invasion of 1796. The Congress of Vienna, in 1814, among its other misdeeds, made over the 4 legations to the Pope. They became a part of the patrimony of St. Peter, their municipal rights were abolished, and contrary to every stipulation, they were reduced to the same condition as the ancient subjects of the Pope. At first the pontiffs thought it necessary to take some steps to reconcile them to the loss of their ancient privileges. They promised them laws in accordance with the improved notions of the times, and that the Code of Napoleon should continue in force. These promises were never fulfilled, and a farrago of laws was imposed impossible to be understood, and forever changing. As each new pope, supported by his infallibility, makes new ones at pleasure, while the corrupt mode in which they are administered increases the vexation of the people. A diminution of their burthens was also promised, but they continued as high as ever, without those attendant circumstances that, in the time of the French, compensated for heavy taxations. Money was then spent in constructing roads and other useful public works. Now the whole treasure is employed to pension the clergy and to support in splendor the state and luxury of the cardinals.